Welcome to the second of our Arthur Jeffrey Centre for the Study of Islam podcast. My name's Dr. Richard Shumack. I'm the director of the centre, and we've begun a short series helping particularly Western Christians, but any Western person understand something about what is going on in the Middle East, particularly to do with the Islamist group Hamas. So last week we talked about who Hamas were. This week, we're going to think a little bit more about the Hamas mindset, and particularly how Hamas believes that in the conflict with Israel that it can win. Once again, I have my colleague, Dr. Mark Jury, with us. And Mark, what would you say, just again, the mindset question, what makes Hamas believe that it can win, particularly given that the conflict that Hamas initiated a few months ago now, they're small. They don't really have a military, at least not in a formal sense. They're taking on a strong formal government with a military that's backed by Western powers. So how can they possibly think that that's a good move? What's behind their confidence in attacking?
Yeah, that's a great question, Richard. And it's not the only question, is it? I mean, I've been pondering recently in these weeks. There's lots of things that people have trouble understanding about this conflict. I think people are shocked at the nature of the demonstrations and the intensity, the targeting of Jewish areas in Melbourne, for example, by demonstrators. What's that about? People are wondering, what does this mean for the future? And there's lots of puzzles about Hamas. And as you said, how can an army of perhaps 30,000 take on an army of 300,000 plus, and indeed a nation with nuclear bomb weapons? And what is all that about? Well, I think there's a lot to think about with this. There's a lot of different aspects to it. I think the fundamental reason is that it's a religious conflict in the eyes of Hamas, and there's a faith conviction that drives everything. Everything has to be understood in the eyes of faith, and it's not about this particular battle. It's about the long term, and there's a deep confidence that Hamas has that they're on the right side of history, and that they will be victorious. Part of that is the view that they have about the land. That once land has been conquered, it really belongs to Islam, and with God on their side, they should be able to get it back again. This is an interesting doctrine that Hamas has put into its charter, that land once conquered is a perpetual legacy or a trust for all Muslims. So Hamas says it's consecrated for the Muslim generations in the future until Judgment Day. So they believe that they have all righteousness on their side. That gives them hope for the future, even though they're hopelessly outnumbered.
Just on that, Mark. So you just said that Islam has this doctrine or this understanding from the Quran that once land has been conquered by Islam or has become Islamic, it's Islamic from then on. Just for a bit of context, why do the Palestinians think that Palestine, or at least why does Hamas, not all Palestinians are Muslim, and certainly not all are in Hamas either, but why do they think that bit of land is Islamic? What's the history there? Just a
well,
brief
context.
It
was conquered by the Arab armies back in the 7th century. It was one of the early areas to be conquered. In the ancient world, there were 5 Christian major centers, the Pentarchy, as it was called: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria in Egypt. And 3, and then later 4 of those were conquered by Islam. So this was once a predominantly Christian area with some Jewish people there too. And then it was conquered in the 7th century. The Crusaders came and tried to win it back, if you like. And then in the end they left, and it's been ruled by the Ottomans for centuries. So from the Islamic perspective, it's been under mostly Islamic control for 1400 years. So they regard the creation of Israel as a disruption and intrusion in that. And they believe that it should be overthrown because it actually is Muslim land. There was one Muslim scholar in the historical past who said the only reason why infidels have property is so that Muslims can take it from them. There's a view about land that it really belongs to God, and therefore God has given it to those that follow him, which from the Islamic point of view is Muslims.
Yeah, so in a sense then, Hamas, they believe that they are the true owners of the land and that they are under occupation and being oppressed or cast off their land. Do you think that's got anything to do with, you mentioned before, there's a sort of a narrative that seems to be quite it's growing, it seems, in the West, that the Palestinians are the oppressed people in this context, and they really have been oppressed by an occupying force in Israel. How do they think about that? How do Western people? How does that fit actual history?
Yeah, that's framed as a kind of colonialism and a post-colonial war. So that's something the West understands. So the colonizers are the Jews by this view, and the Arabs are those that were colonized. And so Richard, you would have seen this, people saying, yes, of course, decolonization is kind of, as one person said, it's messy, bad things happen. You should sort of expect that, and Israel should expect that when the Arabs rise up and tries to overthrow the oppressive Israelis, then of course there'll be bloodshed, and that's only to be expected. And the righteousness belongs on the side of the oppressed, colonized people. So that's a Western take. That's a frame that the Palestinians have used in order to garner support, but it's not fundamentally Hamas's take. Their view is much more grounded in Islamic worldview, in Islamic law, which is it's about the doctrine of jihad and of land, and in fact they're not limited just to, their vision is not just limited to Israel, is it? It's much bigger than Israel. They want to establish something that's much bigger than Israel, don't they?
Oh yeah. Just hold that thought, but just on the colonialism, I think that's right. That the different framings, the Western framing sees it as a post-colonialism struggle, but even that's not accurate. It depends a bit on how far back you want to go, right? So they won it by force, and there's been armies marching through that part of the world for literally thousands of years. And so just purely on who is the owner of the land, historically, that's highly controversial that it belongs to the Palestinians. There's no, they inherited it by force. So you're right, even with that framing, it doesn't quite work. But you're also right that the Hamas, while they'll use that Western mindset, they'll play into it, their propaganda will utilize that for their support outside. You're right, they're driven by it's not really pan-Arab, it's a transnational Islamist ideology that wants to see all Muslim lands return to Islam and then expanded. You're right, that's the bigger context.
And that's one reason why Muslim governments are not too keen on Hamas, because Hamas and the brotherhood that it represents have an ideology that would like to overthrow these regimes and unify them into a caliphate. It's interesting have
we seen that in other places? Other examples of the Hamas, the Islamist fighters, for lack of a better word, have we seen them trying to take down other Muslim governments, not just that they're anti-Israel or anti the Israeli state? Is there the Jewish state? Are there other examples of groups like Hamas trying to take down?
Well, ISIS is an example. The Iranian Revolution in its own way in 1979 was such an example. There have been assassinations. For example, the King of Jordan was assassinated by a Palestinian. there'd been assassinations of politicians in Egypt, I think, and in Lebanon as well. So I think a lot of politicians across the Middle East are quite sensitive to radical groups who want to establish an Islamic State, because they know that they will be targeted by these movements. The Saudis are very tough on any kind of a group that wants to establish the caliphate. It's difficult because they've promoted radical jihadist ideology through their clerics and their teachings and their funding, but they're actually the ones who are first in line, in a way, to be overthrown by such movements. So yeah, it's a common pattern. It's a widespread pattern in the last 100 years of these radical groups threatening regimes. Libya has descended into chaos when the government there was overthrown. I mean, this was the problem of the Arab Spring, that it was thought that this would bring a kind of a period of freedom and openness, but in fact it empowered these radical visionaries who wanted to establish an Islamic society. And Israel is just one target amongst many. I was thinking about what you were saying, Richard, about the history of colonization. Of course, imperial Arab conquest was very much about colonization. And when countries were conquered by the jihad, large numbers of migrants would move in, Arabs and then later Turks would move in and settle areas, as gradually the local indigenous peasantry was destroyed. And that's how Arabic spread across the Middle East, through colonization. In fact, the whole Arab project is the outcome of one of the most successful and aggressive colonization projects in history. And it's ironic now that that Israel, having reclaimed part of that heritage, is seen as deeply offensive, because it's a threat to that sense that the Arabs are the ones who Arabs colonized, they're never colonized. That's the kind of mindset that's happening here.
Yeah, right. That's my point. And I find it fascinating. Even in the Australian context, we've just had a referendum to do with Indigenous people here, and there's a sense in which if you're the first people, that seems to carry some weight, but it's not as simple as, well, if you're here first, you just get the land and nobody else can. There's no possibility of sharing it for future generations of people, depending on background. But certainly in Israel, it's extraordinarily complex. The Jews have been there for 3,500 years. Certainly the original people, there was no one putting up their hand saying, hey, we're the Canaanites. We were there before the Jews. And then, as you say, there have been people moving through that land for thousands and thousands of years.
Well, the PLO has said that there were always Arabs there. It's always been an Arab state. That's their view.
Right. And even that's probably, how long has there been Arabic as a language, or even as a identifiable people group? It's not much older than Islam, right?
Yes, and actually the homeland of the Arabs was the Arabos, that sort of desert area to the south of Israel and into Jordan. It wasn't all of Palestine by any means. So, as you say, Palestine was inhabited by many different groups. But there is this question, how far back in history do you go to find out who's the authentic and original inhabitants of a region? Are the Celts the original Britons, or was it the Saxons who came in from northern Germany and Denmark? What was it? The Vikings that came in later? Was it the Normans who came from France, who'd been, descended from Vikings too? Is it the current? Who has the rights? And I've been thinking a lot about this, about who has rights to national self-determination? Does every group have rights to self-determination? Do the Jews have that? I mean, who has that? Who decides that? And this kind of post-colonial frame that's been imposed on the conflict is just very disconnected from the real world of how nations live and how peace is established as well.
Right, and I think that point's very critical. How does peace establish? Because one of the problems with the contemporary Western framing, which is those with the most rights are the most oppressed, are the victims of colonization. The problem with framing that is it's endless conflict. Like there's no mechanism for peace there. There's no idea of sharing. It's that the oppressed people have to get on top of their oppressors or throw them down. There's no mechanism for sharing. And whatever is going on in Israel at the moment, it's not at all clear who are the oppressed and who are the oppressors, there's no goodies and baddies. It's just a very, very long history of complicated, messy takeovers of that land from all sorts of different directions, and a whole lot of people who are sitting there who all feel like it's their home.
It's by no means the case that the group that is, say, fewer in numbers or poorer in finances or more lacking in opportunities and weaker, it's by no means the case that that's the most righteous group.
No.
Just because a group has power doesn't mean that it's inherently evil. I mean, I think it's a fundamental mistake in Western understandings of the human person. We've sort of denied the idea of individual sin and responsibility for evil in the human heart, and we've located it in unjust structures and political structures. And part of that is the view that those that are powerful must somehow inherently be bad. I mean, this is like the view in communism, where if your ancestors were wealthy, you had to go and get re-educated in a camp. You had a taint of being having privilege in your past. So yeah, I think when the West looks at what's happening in the Middle East, our view is skewed by these assumptions that are so embedded in our culture. Yeah.
And Mark, do you think that's why it explains why we have pro-Palestinian demonstrations and people are noticing the rise of anti-Semitism in the West, but there's a very strong outflowing of sympathy for Palestinians in the West? Do you think that's where it comes from? It comes from that mindset? I think
it's a marrying of two things together. One is this Western take on what is colonization and where does injustice lie, and Israel is perceived as a colonizer. It's not appreciated that I think more than half of Israelis are actually descended from Jews who lived across the Middle East and were expelled or fled, and often in very traumatized circumstances, to Israel in order to find security. They are actually authentic people of the Middle East, a great many of the Israelis. So that's one reason, the Western framing. But there's another reason, which is Islamic theology. In Islamic theology, real victimhood is the prerogative of Muslims. Muslims are the victims. I mean, at the heart of it is a different story of how the faith began. In the Christian tradition, Jesus challenged the view of the Roman Empire that might was right, and his death, in a way, was a demonstration that it was better, as Tom Holland has said, it's better to die or be persecuted for righteousness than to be a persecutor, which is quite the opposite of the way that Roman culture worked. Roman culture thought nothing of destroying people and destroying their lives if they were in an inferior position, and that kind of contribution of Jesus to Western civilization has been extraordinary and transformative. And in a way, the post-colonial frame that's being imposed on this circumstance is a result of that Christian heritage. That is, that those that are vulnerable or those that are oppressed could actually have right on their side is a Christian idea. But the other thing that's coming into play is an Islamic script, which is that the real victimhood is Islam's and Muslims. So there's this phrase in the Quran, which I think is extraordinarily important. It's repeated a couple of times, which says that fitna, persecution, is worse than killing. And fitna refers to the opposition, the persecutions, the difficulties that Muslims experienced from non-Muslims. So in Mecca, the Muslims were challenged and sometimes beaten and spoken ill of and so on. And the way Muhammad responded to that persecution was through violence. He came back with a large army and defeated his enemies, including killing quite a lot of Jews as well. And so the response to persecution that Islam sets up is fighting, and that's considered righteous. So It's killing, actually, literally. And the Quran also says, fight them until there's no more fitna. Kill them, actually. The word for fight in Arabic means to kill. So you've got this script. And in that script, if Muslims are fighting against persecution, then their killing others is not as bad as their experience of persecution. So what that means is the victimhood of the Gazans is greater and worse than whatever that was done to the Israelis. And that's why, after October the 7th, when politicians on both sides of the House expressed compassion for the Jewish victims, the Muslim community rose up and complained. And the Federation of Imams has said, look, you mustn't express sympathy for the Israelis without also expressing sympathy for the Palestinians. But they themselves are completely one-sided in their expressions of sympathy. They only see the victimhood of the Palestinians, and they have refused. I mean, they have not expressed any compassion for Israeli victims. So you've got this twofold forces coming together. One is the Western view of decolonization, and the Jews are kind of bad colonizers, and they're victims of the Palestinians. And the other is this Islamic frame, which is that killing is not as bad as the persecution or suffering of Muslims. And part of that is the denigration, the downplaying of the humanity of the victims of the jihad. And that is not understood, I think, in the West. And so you have this kind of strange marriage of these two. And that's why you in these big rallies, you've got, on the one hand, some Islamists chanting "Gas the Jews," for example, but right. You've also got young university students calling out for decolonization, and this has created a strange and troubling momentum in the midst of Western cultures. Yeah, and you're right. I think that some of this is a Christian legacy, and there's a beautiful side to compassion. You don't ever want to lose the weight of children suffering, and clearly there's been overwhelming, and we see it with contemporary modern news. In the old war's always been hell. The difference now is that everyone has a mobile phone to capture it. And the right response is to both the suffering of the Jewish children and the Palestinian children. The right response is compassion. But I always say to people, the right attitude, just as a Christian, full stop, the attitude is you want soft hearts, but also you need hard heads, you need sharp thinking. And so you want compassion for suffering, but you also need to have a very robust response to that sort of ideology, the ideology that says death is good and that killing is the right way to solve the problem. That can't be responded to with mere compassion. No, when Hamas says, we love death and you love life, and that's why we're going to defeat you. Right. That ideology cannot be permitted to flourish. It will just cause untold grief otherwise. This brings us back to our question: is why does Hamas think it could win? And the framing of the sufferings of the Palestinian peoples in this religious way is part of the engine that drives the conflict forward. Hamas believes that if only they are faithful enough in implying Islam, if only they're faithful enough in jihad, as the Quran says, a small force could defeat a big one. The Quran says, strike terror into the hearts of the enemy. So you have these religious scripts that provide a framework for, you might say, acting out this victimhood, for applying this principle of Islamic victimhood through violence. I think Hamas is hoping that these sorts of sentiments will rise up in the hearts of Muslims everywhere. There have been some calling for attacks on American and Israeli embassies throughout the world. There's a desire to kind of light a fuse, a hope that even this relatively small but highly significant act of killing more than 1,000 Israelis will somehow light a fuse of resistance and opposition. That gives Hamas hope that they would win. That gives them hope that they'll have victory, even though you would have thought in this asymmetrical war they're just a a minnow taking on an elephant. I mean, a whale, sorry, or a mouse taking on an elephant.
So are you saying then that they're not naive about the prospects in a military sense, but the two things that are driving them, on the one hand, you've got, well, God's on our side, and maybe in a way that Christians might understand, it's a bit like circling Jericho, where you've got it's not you that do it, God's on your side, God will give you victory if you're on the right. But wedded to that is another doctrine that death is more glorious than life anyway. So even if you lose in this instance or in this battle, there's a bigger picture eternally as well.
That's true. I think that's one of the drivers is if you get killed, you're in paradise. If you win, then you dominate the enemy. And so you win in this life or the next. It's a win-win proposition. And sadly, I think that's made Hamas callous about its own people. And I do accept the evidence that Hamas puts its military centers under hospitals and schools and so on. And they know that this will cause casualties if they're attacked, civilian casualties. They've shown very little concern for that. In fact, the whole of the October the 7th attack was guaranteed to cause casualties on the Palestinian side. And they did it intentionally. They have their tunnels to protect themselves, but no underground bomb shelters for the civilians. They've planned for this. They've planned to be attacked by Israel. They've planned to be invaded, but not planned for the protection of their people. And I saw a story about a child in the West Bank who was hoping that the Palestinian children will all end up in paradise, that is, that they'll be killed. And I thought, what a distorted way of thinking about the value of life. So what's really interesting to me is that having brought this upon themselves and upon the Gazan people, that many in the West don't seem to hold Hamas to account. You know, if you kick the hornet's nest, you'll be attacked by hornets. If you poke a lion, there'll be a roar, you know. And yet there seems to be a view that it's whenever Israel fights in a way to try and deal with Hamas, that for one, by hook or by crook, it's the fault of the Israelis. And that's sort of disturbing because Hamas has definitely created this. It's brought it on. It's planned for it. It knew it was going to happen. I think it probably thought it would be more successful fighting in the tunnels and fighting against Israeli than the IDF than it has been. The IDF seems to be, surprising them by the success of their operation, but they've definitely brought this upon themselves. And, you know, even that, Richard, is kind of shocking for Western people to understand. Like, how could a movement like this willingly take steps that would lead to the death of thousands of its own people? But the Hamas authorities are standing there ready to advertise their alleged numbers of victims. They're using it to their advantage for propaganda purposes, but they did absolutely nothing to prevent it.
And we shouldn't be surprised if we've read their charter, particularly the original charter, which is perhaps their most straightforward one, the less political one, the 1988 charter, which literally declares that every Muslim essentially and most fundamentally a soldier. Children, women, adults, doesn't matter. If you view your children as soldiers who are dispensable, then we shouldn't be surprised at what we see.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that Hamas might view it as a win-win, but it's certainly a loss. It's a loss for peace, and it's a loss for innocent suffering. We might need to pause the conversation at this point. Thanks, Mark. Next time, I want to dig into this further next time. I want to ask a little bit about what does all this mean, particularly that sort of attitude of Hamas to victory. What does that say to the prospects for peace, for the prospects for things like two-state solutions? I want to pick that up next time. In the meantime, Mark, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Richard. It's good to chat.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.